university has said they're willing to divest from Israel. Perhaps the closest example is when universities responded to students and other stakeholders by divesting from their investments in fossil fuels. But those divestment decisions are still being debated.
How so?
I mean, universities got to take a clear stand. We don't want to contribute to climate change. And that's fair, it's their money. But a lot of universities that divested from fossil fuels in recent years missed that on a spectacular rally in oil companies. So ultimately, was that the right decision? Well, it depends on how you look at it. Yes, it made a bold statement on climate, but it was also a lot of money that was left on the table that could have gone to benefit a lot of students.
That's NPR's Raphael Nam. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.
Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is the second in a planned trilogy of video games remaking and expanding the story and world of Final Fantasy VII. Part of what makes the Final Fantasy franchise so beloved is its musical score. Which means its composers were faced with a huge challenge: make music that pleases fans of the original score while also doing something new and surprising. NPR's Vincent Acavina has more.
Released in 1997 for the original PlayStation, Final Fantasy VII was a revelation when it came out. Telling the story of a spiky-haired swordsman fighting for the survival of the world, it was more cinematic than other games at the time. The visuals were breathtaking, and the musical score from composer Nobuo Uematsu was memorable, to say the least. It borrowed from classical music, pop music, and especially progressive rock.
そうですね、やはりその歴代のファイナルファンタジーシリーズ
Do you think this is due to Uematsu-san's melodies from the original Final Fantasy VII being ones that are just recalled with ease and remain in their hearts?
That's Rebirth's music supervisor, Keiji Kawamori. Kawamori says the tracks are different from your average orchestral video game soundtrack, edgier.
あとその上松信夫さん時代そのファイナルファンタジーの音楽でいろいろなチャレンジをしていて
They're profound, and at the same time, his compositions often incorporate a sort of new idea that perhaps goes against the status quo of music so far.
Kawamori and his team set out to recreate that feeling. Musical motifs are hidden like Easter eggs in Rebirth songs. Take this theme, used during many of the game's fight sequences.
So this is the battle arrangement of the main theme, but for those listening very closely, you may notice that there is another underlying or hidden track from Final Fantasy VII included called Let the Battles Begin.
That's Rebirth composer Matsuko Suzuki. Also, I believe each of the characters has a strong and impressionable beat, like for Aerith. I think this adds to it. Aerith is a fan-favorite character from the original game. And that's the theme that plays during her death, which was heartbreaking for players when they encountered it back in the day, says video game music expert Matt Ombler.
The needle drop when that theme plays and the way that entire scene plays out, so many people experience that feeling of loss.
In Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that moment too is updated and reinterpreted. And the challenge for the music team was, how do you revisit such a canonized moment? One that distills that feeling of loss in a way that is still heartbreaking all these years later. Here's Kawamori.
始まってエアリスのテーマのアレンジなんですが、結構そのエアリスのテーマってピアノのイメージが
I
強いん
think
です
when
が
players think of Aerith's theme, they might typically think of a piano arrangement, but we wanted to add a bit of variation and do something different for Rebirth. So for this arrangement, we're going in with the chorus.
At its very best moments, the music of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth distills the spirit of Final Fantasy VII and gives it a surprising and unexpected new twist. Here's Matt Ombler again.
The whole idea of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is they flip the original plot on its head. I think that's why they play with the music so much, so that the scenes that people experienced in the original game are not necessarily going to play out the same way.
The official soundtrack for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is out now, and it spans more than 9 hours of music. But the third game in this remake trilogy is currently in development, which means composers are far from finished when it comes to reimagining the beloved world. Vincent Acquino, NPR News.
You're listening to All Things Considered here on WNYC. Last week's reversal of Harvey Weinstein's 2020 rape conviction has led to a surge in calls to the National Sexual Assault Hotline.
Most survivors do their best to live their lives, but sometimes something jumps into the frame that is just, you can't ignore.
More on what victims and survivors are saying coming up after news headlines. 77 degrees now, dropping down to 57 degrees tonight, with skies remaining mostly clear. This is WNYC.
On the next All of It, the new documentary Uncropped explores the life and career of revered local photographer James Hamilton. His images of pop stars and politicians have popped off the pages of publications like The Village Voice and New York Magazine. We'll speak with him and director D.W. Young. Plus, we'll talk about the Metropolitan Opera's new production of the John Adams opera El Niño. Join us for All of It, weekdays at noon on WNYC.
WNYC is supported by Bang on a Can, presenting the Long Play Festival. Music performances featuring Steve Reich, Ryuichi Sakamoto, Patti Smith, Terry Riley, and over 50 concerts at BAM and throughout downtown Brooklyn. May 3rd through 5th, longplayfestival.org.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Live from NPR News in Culver City, California, I'm Dwayne Brown. As students across the U.S. call for an end to the war in Gaza and university investment in Israel, some of their professors are showing their support for free speech. As NPR's Rachel Treisman reports.
Professors are among the hundreds of people who have been arrested at protests at Indiana University, UW-Madison, and others in recent weeks. Some say they were there to protect students as police arrived to break up the crowds. Professors at Emory and USC have since held protests of their own, demanding that universities keep their hands off students. Meanwhile, some faculty members at Barnard College and other schools are calling on their leaders to resign over their handling of the protests. Elsewhere, hundreds are signing letters asking leadership to take specific actions, such as dropping charges against arrested students and reinstating those who were suspended. Rachel Treisman, NPR News.
The federal government says the U.S. is well prepared to produce a vaccine against the bird flu if necessary, but NPR's Rob Stein reports some independent experts are skeptical.
Federal health officials say they already have 2 possible vaccines in the government's emergency stockpile and hundreds of thousands of doses ready to go in vials and syringes. In addition, officials say millions of additional doses could be produced within weeks or months. Some independent experts, however, say it remains unclear how effective those vaccines really are, and note that it would take months to produce enough vaccine for everyone who would need to get vaccinated should a bird flu pandemic ever erupt. Rob Stein, NPR News.
Well, stocks finished higher on Wall Street today, clawing back some of their losses from earlier this week as shares of Qualcomm, Carvana, and other tech companies rose on better than expected earnings in the second quarter. The Dow gained 322 points, tech-heavy NASDAQ up 1.5%. This is NPR.
And this is WNYC in New York. I'm David First. 75 degrees, it's 5:33. Mayor Adams says police data show the majority of those arrested Tuesday night for protesting in Colombia.
Infinity ahead of me is pretty full, visibly through the rear window, and the independent suspension on the rear is showing that kind of splayed look from having the springs heavily compressed. And overall the car seems to be not super happy, but it is noticeable.
At Columbia and City College. A Brooklyn man has pleaded guilty to selling the head of a cougar to an undercover investigator. As WNYC's Samantha Max reports, officials found the man had a whole collection of illegal animal parts.
Prosecutors say Usher Weiss will pay a $5,000 fine for selling the mounted cougar head to an undercover investigator for the State Department of Environmental Conservation. They say the investigator gave Weiss $900 for it in November. Weiss then offered the investigator a mounted cheetah head for $10,000. Prosecutors say a month later, Weiss gave the investigator the cheetah head, another big cat skull, the skin of a seal pup, and a mounted bird. Weiss's lawyer says his client didn't mean to break the law. He says Weiss is a professional collector and got confused about the complicated laws for collecting and selling wild animal parts.
If you're driving in or even near Connecticut today, be aware it is still a mess on I-95 around Norwalk, where a crash involving a car, tractor-trailer, and a tanker truck that spilled thousands of gallons of gas continues to cause major delays. Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont says officials are working to keep drivers away from the crash site.
They've already sent out a text alert to everybody from Port Chester to Bridgeport. Stay away from that area.
He adds that no one suffered any major injuries. Officials in the state are advising drivers to take other highways or use mass transit. Delays on L, Q, and 4 trains in both directions. Also seeing delays on northbound C, E, N, R, and W trains. There's a crash on the Long Island Expressway westbound near Searingtown Road. In the left and center lanes, they are both closed. 75 degrees now, mostly clear skies tonight with a low of 57. Tomorrow, mostly sunny with a high of 67.
Support for NPR comes from member stations and from Easy Cater, committed to helping companies, from nonprofits to the Fortune 500, find restaurants that cater meetings and events. With online ordering and 24/7 live support. Learn more at easycater.com. And Indeed, designed to be an end-to-end hiring solution for businesses of all sizes to attract, interview, and hire candidates, all from one platform. Learn more at Indeed.com/NPR.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Elsa Chang.
And I'm Juana Summers. Last week, Harvey Weinstein's 2020 rape conviction was overturned by a New York court, and the New York District Attorney announced yesterday that the 72-year-old will be retried for sex crimes. Critics see this justice system reversal as a step backward when it comes to sexual abuse survivors getting the justice they deserve. Scott Berkowitz is the founder and president of RAINN, that's the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. The organization serves survivors and the people who care about them. RAINN also operates the National Sexual Assault Hotline. Scott Berkowitz joins us now. Welcome to All Things Considered.
Thanks, Juana.
So, Scott, as I mentioned, RAINN operates a national hotline that victims and survivors can call. What have things been like for the hotline since the Weinstein conviction was overturned last week?
They've been busy. We see whenever there's a really large news story like this, something that impacts survivors, we always see an increase in the number of people reaching out to us and a whole lot of people who want to talk about the decision and talk about their disappointment and sometimes anger about the decision being thrown out.
What do you think it is specifically about moments like this, whether it's this case or other high-profile cases of sexual abuse that might be in the news, that leads to that kind of uptick?
You know, I think that most survivors do their best to live their lives and to go through their day-to-day, but sometimes something jumps into the frame that is just either really good or really infuriating. And I think that the Harvey Weinstein case has been so visible. It's something, millions of Americans have followed. It really makes people stop, pay attention, and for survivors, prompts them to start reflecting on their own experience and the challenges that they faced.
Obviously, a part of the work that the people who staff those victim services programs do is confidentiality, but I'm wondering, just generally speaking, when people are calling in or reaching out online, can you give us a sense of the type of things that you're hearing?
Yeah, it hits everyone a little differently. One of the interesting things about this case in particular is there was so much attention on it. The survivors really bravely stepped up and testified in court. They did everything right. And to see it all get thrown out on effectively a loophole is frustrating to people. And it certainly makes some question whether it's worth their effort to go through the challenging process of the investigation and the prosecution.
How does a service like the National Sexual Assault Hotline help victims and survivors deal with this kind of trauma that they're dealing with right now?
Our staff are really trained to help tailor the session to the survivor's needs. Sometimes we hear from survivors calling just minutes or hours after an assault. They, more often than not, have a lot of very practical questions about what sort of medical care they should get, what are the risks that they should be tested for, what to expect if they call 911 and report. But we also get a lot of calls from survivors calling, months or years after the assault. I mean, in those cases, they tend to be looking much more for emotional support.
And Scott, I'll just ask you briefly, if someone who's listening to this conversation is in need of support, what's the best way for them to reach out?
You can get help from the National Sexual Assault Hotline both by telephone at 1-800-656-HOPE, H-O-P-E, or through online chat at hotline.rain.org, R-A-I-N-N. And the National Sexual Assault Hotline operates 24/7. It's confidential, and the services are always free.
That's RAIN founder and president Scott Berkowitz. Scott, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
To San Antonio now, one of the cities feeling the strain of an ongoing flow of asylum seekers crossing the southern border. The city's Immigrant Assistance Center has become a vital way station where each year hundreds of thousands of migrants seek food, shelter, and legal aid. But the center operates on tenuous federal funding from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and local officials worry the cycle of crisis financing is unsustainable without broader congressional action on immigration reform. Texas Public Radio's Josh Peck reports.
San Antonio's Centro de Bienvenida Migrant Resource Center is a 71,000 square foot facility with a cafeteria, outdoor mobile showers, entertainment rooms, an interfaith chapel, and 2 floors with hundreds of cots for asylum seekers to sleep. At times, the center's population has been double its internal capacity of 707. That crowding has forced migrants to sleep in the parking lot and in the nearby street.
In November, December, we have hundreds of people every day here. It was really, really sad because you wanted to have people sleeping in beds or cats, and we couldn't because we didn't have enough.
That's Antonio Fernandez, the executive director of the Catholic Charities Archdiocese of San Antonio, which has operated the FEMA-funded center since 2022. When he gave me a tour of the facility recently, it housed between 300 and 350 people. The center has helped more than 280,000 migrants over the last 2 years. Migrants are given fresh clothes and can play games, shower, eat culturally familiar food, and even watch Disney movies on TV. Outside the center, children play with scooters and toy trucks on a dead-end street between the facility and a strip mall, while parents chat and get fresh air sitting on nearby concrete walls. Malcri Sanchez is from Venezuela, and she's seeking asylum here along with her husband and daughter.
There's nothing to eat in Venezuela, and they don't pay well for work.
Sanchez says her family plans to go to Chicago, where she's heard there's lots of help for migrants. The person who is going to house them in San Antonio hasn't returned her calls. Right now, she's trying to get her November 20th asylum court appearance moved from San Antonio to Chicago.
I feel worried, to be honest, because if you don't have the funds to pay for an attorney, or the attorney doesn't show up, or if we don't show up, I don't know what the consequences will be.
The consequences could be deportation. Fernandez with Catholic Charities is also worried. A recently passed federal spending package will let Catholic Charities continue operating the center through September of 2025, but its long-term funding is uncertain. Migrants get to the center after immigration authorities release them with a pending court date for their asylum petition. They can stay in the center up to 45 days from the date they cross the border. Fernandez says they inform them of their rights and about legal aid groups that can offer help. But he says the center no longer has the federal funds to pay for bus or plane tickets if migrants intend to leave San Antonio. So many, he says, are stuck in the city.
They have to have their own resources to get to the final destinations, which makes things a lot difficult because many of them don't have the money. So they had to pay.
The center also relies on city services, like police officers who provide security and city sanitation workers. City officials are not sure how long they can continue to support the center. San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg, an independent who aligned himself with Democrats, says they need key federal changes, including more resources to speed up the asylum process. And he'd like to see migrants have the ability to work legally while their court cases play out. Lack of congressional action on those border issues, he says, means an indefinite state of crisis.
Until we have some legislators with backbone to deal with those issues upstream, we're not going to see an end of the waxing and waning of the migration impacts at the local level.
The mayor says that means large numbers of migrants will keep crossing the border, eventually ending up in one of Texas's largest migrant resource centers for asylum seekers.
This is dealing with the impact of an issue that the federal government, i.e. Congress, has responsibility for.
Mayor Nirenberg says if Congress doesn't pass immigration reform, San Antonio will be destabilized by a seemingly endless wave of migrants in need of services that they may not be able to provide. For NPR News, I'm Josh Peck in San Antonio.
You're listening to All Things Considered from NPR News. This year, Indiana has its first competitive primary for governor in 2 decades. 6 Republicans are seeking their party's nomination. It's an open seat as current governor Eric Holcomb is term limited after 8 years in office. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith reports that Holcomb isn't endorsing anyone, not even his lieutenant governor.
Holcomb first started getting questions about an endorsement a year and a half ago, especially once his governing partner, Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch, joined the race. But he resisted, at first acknowledging that Crouch needed to be her own candidate.
I don't want anyone thinking that just because she and I work so closely together that she's a clone of me.
Despite Holcomb's solid approval rating from Indiana voters, it's a little different in the Republican base. The right wing's anger is focused primarily on Holcomb's policies trying to combat COVID-19. Crouch has been happy to distance herself on that issue.
We can't go back and change what happened, but I've learned from the mistakes of our top executive.
But she doesn't shy away from her resume, which includes decades of elected office. In one of the primary's debates, a moderator asked her why so many of the candidates try to claim they're the outsider in the race.
How can anyone in this primary claim to be an outsider?
I don't know. But you know, I'm proud of my public service.
So is it awkward that her previous running mate hasn't backed her? Mike O'Brien has worked in Indiana politics for 2 decades and ran Holcomb's 2016 campaign for governor. He's also informally advising Crouch in this race and says the governor doesn't want to risk hurting her with an endorsement.
Maybe you don't want it to not be helpful, right? If you're the leader of the party, you want to we've got perfectly legitimate candidates here. Any one of them can serve in the role as governor. Let's just let that play itself out.
So if a Holcomb endorsement isn't driving this race, what is? Perhaps another endorsement. Former President Donald Trump, who jumped in early to back U.S. Senator Mike Braun.
He is the guy that broke the system at the federal level, and now the system's trying to take him out. So if you want to know who the outsider is, that's very clear, and I represent that here.
O'Brien says in a state where Trump's favorability among Republicans is in the 80s, that's a huge factor.
Maybe the simple analysis is the right one, and that is Trump endorsed Mike Braun. He started out with the most name ID and a lot of money, and that's all really it's going to take right now in the context of a Republican primary.
A lot of money is putting it mildly. The 6 Republicans will spend around $40 million by Election Day, a record for campaign spending in an Indiana primary. Braun spent $6 million alone in just the first 3 months of the year. The bulk of that has blanketed Indiana's airwaves with campaign ads. And University of Indianapolis political scientist Laura Merrifield Wilson says all that spending likely ends up helping Braun.
The benefit that Braun has in this particular primary is the fact that there are several other candidates that really seem to split the electorate.
In the race's limited public polling, Braun has led his next closest opponent, Crouch, by 20 to 30 points each time. But Wilson notes the number of voters in those polls who say they're undecided is between around 20 to 40%, which she says is why there's still so much money being spent.
I think there is still that hope, and we recognize in a gubernatorial primary, probably up until Election Day, you're going to have at least a portion of undecided voters.
Besides, Wilson says there's no point saving the money for the general election. Indiana hasn't elected a Democrat to any statewide office in 12 years, so the next governor will likely be decided on May 7th. For NPR News, I'm Brandon Smith in Indianapolis.
The long history of accusations that outside players are influencing student protests. We'll have that story coming up next on All Things Considered here on WNYC.
On the next Brian Lair Show, could this be the year that marijuana becomes legal nationwide? Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has just introduced a bill, and President Biden is taking steps to help medical research and today's legal dispensaries succeed. We'll explain. Also, excerpts from a new podcast about competition and girlhood in America. The Brian Lair Show, weekdays at 10 a.m. on WNYC.
WNYC supporters include Carnegie Hall presenting pianist Yefim Brofman in recital featuring Prokofiev's Piano Sonata No. 7, Schubert's Piano Sonata in A minor, and more. May 5th at 3 p.m. Tickets at carnegiehall.org. Leadership support for WNYC's local and global news coverage is provided by the Jerome L. Green Foundation, partnering with organizations to promote justice and equality for all New Yorkers.
New York City's Parks Department is looking for some splashy ideas about what to do with local pools outside of the summer months. The department wants to reimagine 6 outdoor pools that are closed between October and March for recreation, programming, concessions, or services during those months. They are McCarran Pool in Brooklyn, Foster Pool in the Bronx, Astoria Pool in Queens, as well as Jackie Robinson Pool in Harlem, Thomas Jefferson Pool in East Harlem, and Hamilton Fish Pool on the Lower East Side. NYC Parks issued a request for expressions of interest today with a meeting for those interested slated for May 10th. 75 degrees right now, mostly clear tonight with a low of 57.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Elsa Chang.
And I'm Juana Summers. University administrators and law enforcement around the country continue to crack down on campus demonstrations protesting Israel's war in Gaza. In New York City, the city's police force has arrested hundreds across multiple colleges and cleared protest encampments. New York Mayor Eric Adams has said that outside agitators have co-opted these protests, and he cited preliminary police intelligence to NPR's Morning Edition earlier today.
It appears as though that over 40% of those who participated in Columbia and CUNY were not from the school and they were outsiders.
The refrain of malign outside influence has been common from school and government authorities during this wave of protests. Of course, supporters of the student movements have also blamed people unaffiliated with their colleges for hijacking their activism. Whatever the case, the concept has a long history in American life. It was notably wielded to delegitimize abolitionists and civil rights leaders in the 20th century, and Black Lives Matter protests in 2020.
That year, NPR's Code Switch podcast tackled this history with Peniel Joseph, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, who is also founding director of the school's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. He spoke with hosts Shireen Marisol Meraji and Gene Demby, and the conversation turned to the 2014 protests over the killing of a Black man in Ferguson, Missouri.
Gene and I were both in Ferguson 6 years ago reporting on the protests that were happening then. Gene was doing a lot of reporting in the Black community. I was assigned to talk to white people in Ferguson, and nearly every person I spoke to blamed people who lived outside of Ferguson for what was happening in their town. You know, the nightly protests, the destruction of property, and that outside agitator trope. It became one of the major storylines in 2014. It was everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the outside agitator trope, whether it's to denounce left-wing or anti-racist forces, or to even denounce culpability with right-wing or alt-right white nationalist causes, is something that's utilized as a trope to really defend white supremacy through pleas of either white innocence or pleas of saying that these Black folks who are protesting are not our authentic Black folks. And that has a very, very long history. The idea that in the South, we treat our colored people good.
Well, we heard it when we were in Ferguson, and after Ferguson especially, a lot of organizers were saying that they were frustrated that people from other places had come to the city and had become the faces of Ferguson in some cases.
very different goals from organized underground in St. Louis County. Historically, those tensions are very real, and there's sort of no way to stop those tensions. SNCC probably tried the best because what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee did during the 1960s was organize African Americans who were in Arkansas, the Southwest of Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and organize them for civil rights, voting rights, but they tried to ask local communities what they needed and assist in cultivating local leadership who would then lead the local movements. So that's really unprecedented. But other organizations did something different. So the best person here to look at is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. SCLC was an organization of political mobilizers, led by the greatest of all time in the 20th century political mobilizer is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Sometimes he received permission to assist a local movement. Sometimes he did not. And local people were left very, very upset about the dissonance between what Martin Luther King Jr. might be trying to negotiate and what they felt was the authentic measure of their own local needs. So what happened in Ferguson has a very, very long history where certain activists who were not from Ferguson absolutely came into Ferguson, were perceived as the symbolic faces of the local movement, and local people got so upset with these activists, some of whom became media stars, that those same figures can no longer visit Ferguson. Right.
But we're having this conversation about the outside agitator trope. Is this the same type of thing? I mean, can we compare this type of pointing the finger at you're not from here in the same way as we are when we talk about, you know, public officials or those who are in power and have power who call other people outside agitators?
No, I don't think we're comparing the same thing. Those are apples and oranges. So that the outside agitator trope is really designed to undermine, to disrupt social protest movements, and at times, as we see with Charlottesville, to undermine an exposure of white supremacy by trying to say that you are innocent from these racist forces that are in your backyard. So you say, I didn't know about this. So that's sort of the difference between the Klan and the White Citizens Council during the 1950s and 60s. The Klan is who everyone repudiates. The more powerful expression of white supremacy was the White Citizens Councils, who were the business leaders, the civic leaders, the faith leaders, who made sure that massive resistance worked and that racial integration did not succeed in public schools or neighborhoods in the South.
That's University of Texas at Austin professor Peniel Joseph speaking in 2020. The idea of the outside agitator lives on in the rhetoric around campus protests today. But in 2020 or 2024, protest movements like Black Lives Matter or pro-Palestinian encampments, they go national quickly. So who is even on the inside or outside anymore? Joseph told NPR that he doesn't believe the term has the power it once did.
It doesn't have teeth anymore for a few reasons. You know, it's about the political divide, but also the demographics of the country changed. It's the same reason why Barack Obama, no matter how eloquent he was, he could not have been president of the United States in 1968 or 1988 or 1996. The first time he could be president was in 2008 and 2012 because he could knit together a coalition that only needed, at its high point, 43% of white voters to become president of the United States.
Crash, fire, stuff. Actually, multiple vehicle crash. I think that's 5 or perhaps 6 vehicles involved in that crash.
The Grab Here's podcast, Code Switch.
It's All Things Considered here on WNYC. Coming up on Marketplace, while the federal government is pouring money into the semiconductor industry, some workers are hoping to cash in.
I have a 10-month-old, so I just needed, some income.
Workers trying to get a piece of the pie. That's coming up at 6:30 on Marketplace. And later on tonight's On Point, a forgotten chapter in civil rights history. In 1956, a federal judge ordered the town of Clinton, Tennessee to desegregate its high school. The unrest that followed tore the town apart. Tune in tonight at 8 o'clock for On Point here on WNYC and stay with us for Latino USA. That's coming up at 9 o'clock tonight. 75 degrees right now, expecting mostly clear skies tonight. Will drop down to 57 degrees. And then tomorrow, mostly sunny, not as warm as it was today, just a high of 67 degrees. And it will stay on the cooler side over the next few days, up to 63 on Saturday, partly sunny. Chance of showers on Sunday with a high of just 61 degrees. WNYC, 6 o'clock.
Support for NPR comes from WNYC members and from Indiana University, committed to moving the world forward and working to tackle some of society's biggest challenges. 9 campuses, 1 purpose. Creating tomorrow today. More at iu.edu. Progressive Insurance with Snapshot, which monitors safe driving habits to determine a personalized rate at progressive.com. Not available in California or from all agents. And Fisher Investments. Fisher is committed to helping clients stay on track to reach their financial goals and enjoy a comfortable retirement. FisherInvestments.com. Investing in securities involves the risk of loss.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM, New York.
Workers are still removing the debris of the old Key Bridge from Baltimore Harbor. The legal fight over who will pay to replace it has already begun. It's Thursday, May 2nd. I'm David First, and this is All Things Considered from NPR and WNYC. Also this hour, President Biden addresses the pro-Palestinian demonstrations roiling college campuses around the country.
It needs to be done without violence, without destruction, without hate, in the law.
More on the president's remarks. Plus, congestion pricing lawsuits, and the MTA looks to stop cars from blocking buses. We'll break down all of the latest transit news. Those stories just ahead, right after news headlines.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Spear. There were some heated exchanges this morning between Stormy Daniels' lawyer, Keith Davidson, who was on the witness stand, and former President Donald Trump's criminal defense team. Whereas Andrea Bernstein has more.
In 2016, Davidson represented both Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels, both of whom say they had sexual relations with Trump early on in his marriage to Melania. Davidson got them money to keep quiet. Davidson is a Hollywood lawyer who frequently makes these kinds of settlements that include non-disclosure agreements. He said at the end of the 2016 campaign, then Trump attorney Michael Cohen finally paid Daniels $130,000, which Davidson said Cohen was putting up the money for. On cross-examination, Trump attorney Emile Beauvais brought up previous settlements Davidson had arranged with Hulk Hogan and Charlie Sheen, suggesting these settlements were just this side of extortion. Andrea Bernstein, NPR News, New York.
Arizona's governor has signed a bill that would repeal an 1864 law that banned virtually all abortions in that state. The law coming into play after the Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. Democratic Governor Katie Hobbs called the move to return the Civil War-era ban to the dustbin of history, just the beginning of a battle to protect reproductive health care in the state.
Today, we should not rest, but we should recommit to protecting women's bodily autonomy, their ability to make their own healthcare decisions, and the ability to control their lives. Let me be clear. I will do everything in my power to protect our reproductive freedoms, because I trust women to make the decisions that are best for them.
The repeal of the law, dating back to a period before Arizona was even a state, was approved this week in the Arizona Senate, where it will not take effect until 90 days after the end of the current legislative session. The healthcare CEO's subsidiary was breached by hackers is under pressure from lawmakers. NPR's Jenny McLaughlin reports they want United Health to step up security. make things right with millions of Americans whose private health care data may have been stolen.
During multiple congressional hearings this week, United Health Group CEO Andrew Whitty faced rounds of intense questioning over his company's response to a recent major cyber attack. Lawmakers wanted to know why Change Healthcare, a subsidiary of his company which manages digital payments, was unprepared to respond to an attack that crippled practically the entire healthcare system for weeks. Whitty told the lawmakers that Change Healthcare was in the process of updating old systems, but the server that was breached did not have multi-factor authentication installed. He also said it was his decision to pay a ransom. While the company investigates records leaked on the dark web, they're offering free credit monitoring and identity theft services for potential victims. Jenna McLaughlin, NPR News.
Stocks regained some lost ground after yesterday's post-Fed meeting sell-off. The Dow was up 322 points. The Nasdaq rose 235 points. This is NPR.
And this is WNYC in New York. I'm David First. 75 degrees, 4 minutes after 6 o'clock. The town of Hempstead in Long Island is the latest to file a lawsuit seeking to block the MTA's congestion pricing program. The federal suit argues the $15 base fare wrongly punishes drivers for going below 60th Street in Manhattan. It comes on top of lawsuits filed by the state of New Jersey, Rockland County, New York City's teachers union, and others. The MTA says the tolls will reduce traffic and bring in revenue